Epigraph to Stories of the Victoria Cross. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Stories of the Victoria Cross by Frank Mundell. Epigraph. Thus saith the Queen, for him who gave his life as nothing in the fight, so he from Russian wrong might save my crown, my people, and my right. Let there be made a cross of bronze, and grave thereon my queenly crest. Write valour on its haughty scroll, and hang it on his breast. Thus saith the land, he who shall bear Victoria's cross upon his breast, in token that he did not fear to die, had need been, for her rest. For the dear sake of her who gives, and the high deeds of him who wears, shall, high or low, all honour have, from all through all his years. By Sir Edwin Arnold. End of epigraph. Chapter 1 of Stories of the Victoria Cross by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Victoria Cross. During the struggle in the Crimea, when our soldiers were almost daily performing feats of valour and astonishing the world by their matchless daring, Queen Victoria read with keen interest the reports from the seat of war. When she saw how willingly both officers and privates faced the death-dealing torrent of grape-shot and shell, not only for the honour of their country, but often also that they might carry succour to a fallen comrade, she felt that something should be done by way of special recognition of their gallantry, something which should also prove an incentive to great and noble conduct on the field of battle. Accordingly, in the year 1856, Her Majesty instituted, by royal warrant, the famous decoration known as the Victoria Cross. In the Sign Manual, issued at the time, the following passage occurs: Now, for the purpose of attaining an end so desirable as that of rewarding individual instances of merit and valour, we have instituted and created a new naval and military decoration, which we are desirous should be highly prized and eagerly sought after by the officers and men of our naval and military services. This decoration took the form of a Maltese cross in bronze. In the centre of the cross is the royal crest, and underneath it is a scroll, on which are inscribed the words "For Valour." On the reverse side is given a brief account of the deed for which the medal has been awarded. The cross is suspended from the left breast of the wearer by a blue ribbon for the Navy and by a red ribbon for the Army. On the bar to which the ribbon is attached is a sprig of laurel and the hero's name. The value of the cross amounts only to a few shillings. Yet there is not a man of any rank in the Army or Navy who is not proud to be the wearer of this simple Maltese cross. The decoration is only awarded to those, either officers or men, who, in the presence of an enemy, have performed some signal act of valour. Further, in order that all may be on a perfectly equal footing, it was decreed that neither rank, nor long service, nor wounds, nor any other circumstance of condition whatsoever, save the merit of conspicuous bravery, shall be held to establish a sufficient claim to the honour. The Treaty of Peace, which brought the terrible struggle with Russia to an end, was signed in 1856, and on the 26th of June in the same year the first presentation of the Victoria Cross took place in Hyde Park, in the presence of many thousands of spectators. The troops who were to take part in the ceremony were drawn up in line about 9 o'clock, and those who were to be decorated stood in single file opposite. Shortly afterwards, the firing of guns announced the approach of the royal party. The Queen, mounted on a white horse, rode between the Prince Consort and Prince Frederick William of Prussia, afterwards Emperor of Germany. She was dressed in a scarlet tunic, with a gold embroidered sash over her left shoulder. She also wore a round hat with a gold band and a plume of red and white feathers. The heroes who had earned the coveted decoration on many a hard-fought field advanced one by one, men of all ranks and ages, officers and privates, grim and bearded veterans by the side of smooth-faced youths who had just completed their first campaign. As each man approached, and Her Majesty, stooping from her saddle, fixed the cross that bore her name on the hero's breast, cheer after cheer arose from the immense throng of admiring spectators. After the crosses had been distributed, the troops marched past, presented arms, and gave 3 cheers for Her Majesty and the heroes of the day. The Queen then left the park amidst the hearty cheers of the assembled multitude, having added another to those good acts of womanly and queenly grace which have made her name loved and revered throughout the land. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Stories of the Victoria Cross by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Heroes of the Alma. The first battle of the Crimean War was fought on the 20th of September 1854. The Russian army was strongly posted on the heights overlooking the river Alma, and from this commanding position they poured an incessant fire on the British force which was advancing against them. With grim determination our men crossed the river, scaled the heights, and drove the Russians from their stronghold. Many deeds of valour were performed on that eventful day. Few veterans ever displayed greater courage than did Lieutenant Lindsay of the Scots Fusilier Guards, though he was only 21 years of age, and this was his first battle. Lindsay carried the colours of his regiment, which drew upon him the fire of the enemy. During the passage of the river, and while ascending the heights, he advanced steadily and unwounded, though men fell right and left of him. An idea of the danger through which he passed may be formed from the fact that, at the close of the day, there were found 23 bullet holes in the flag, and the staff was broken. As the regiment neared the Russian battery, a cry was heard, "Fusiliers, retire!" Thinking that the order was intended for them, some of the men fell back. The officers, knowing that the command had been given to another regiment of Fusiliers, and seeing their own men in the act of retreating, did all in their power to correct the mistake, no one being more conspicuous in this than Lieutenant Lindsay. In spite of their efforts, the soldiers continued to retreat, but the colour escort under Lindsay held their ground and waited till the troops should be brought back to their support. While in this position they were attacked by a body of Russians, and for some moments it seemed as if the little band would be cut to pieces and the standard captured. Almost all the escort fell, but Lindsay and another officer stood back to back and kept off the enemy with their revolvers. Seeing what was going on in front, Sergeant McKechnie and Private Reynolds hurried a few men forward, and at the same time Captain Drummond, who had been held down by his dead horse, rushed to their assistance, revolver in hand. This little band succeeded in keeping the Russians at bay until the troops came up and the colours were saved. For their conduct on this occasion, Lieutenant Lindsay, Sergeant McKechnie and Private Reynolds received the Victoria Cross. Now let us turn to the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, several of whom distinguished themselves in this great battle. Seeing that the Russians were abandoning their position, Ensign Anstruther, who was but a youth, dashed forward with the colours in his hand, eager to win glory on that great day. In advance of his comrades he gained the redoubt, dug the butt end of his flagstaff into the parapet, and stood there for a moment looking round him with a triumphant smile. But he had already become an object of mark to the Russian riflemen, and a bullet sent with too true an aim laid him low. Even in death he did not relax his grasp of the flagstaff, and as he fell the silken folds of the banner enveloped his body, a glorious pall. A colour sergeant named Luke O'Connor vainly endeavoured to keep pace with the fleet-footed Anstruther, and was struck down by a shot in the breast before he could gain the top of the parapet. The symbols of regimental honour were now in danger of falling into the enemy's hands. Seeing this, one of the soldiers rushed forward, and was in the act of taking the colours from Anstruther's lifeless grasp, when O'Connor, roused by the thought of losing the honour for which he had striven, sprang to his feet, seized the flagstaff, and proudly set it up again on the redoubt. When the movement had succeeded, and the position was in the hands of the British, the officer advised O'Connor to go to the rear, where his wound would receive attention. But the gallant fellow could not be persuaded to forego the honour of carrying the flag. Though weak from loss of blood, he kept his post till the close of the battle. Then it was found that the colours had been hit in 75 places. For this splendid display of courage, O'Connor received the thanks of his commander on the field, and was afterwards decorated with the Victoria Cross. When the British entered the great redoubt, they found that the Russians had succeeded in carrying off many of their guns, and were in the act of removing the remainder. Captain Bell of the Royal Welsh saw that one of the guns, dragged by only 3 horses, had not yet reached the rear of the redoubt. In a moment he resolved, come what might, to capture that gun. Though on foot, he made his way as rapidly as possible after the retreating gun. When he came up with it, he seized the bridle of the leading horse, presented his unloaded pistol at the driver's head, and ordered him to dismount. Though the Russian did not understand the words in which the order was given, he had no doubt of the meaning they were intended to convey. He therefore dismounted and made off without offering the slightest resistance. Bell instantly turned the gun round, but at that moment his superior officer rode up and ordered him back to his regiment, for in leaving it, even to capture a gun, he had been guilty of a breach of discipline. The captain had of course to obey, yet not until he had started the horses in the direction of the British lines, where the capture was complete. The horses were used in one of our batteries for some time, and the gun may still be seen at Woolwich. For this daring act Captain Bell received the Victoria Cross. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Stories of the Victoria Cross by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Heroes of Inkerman. During the darkness and gloom of a misty November morning, about 60,000 Russians climbed the hill on the top of which was encamped the British army of 8,000 men. Our soldiers were scattered about the hill in small parties, little dreaming of the near presence of the enemy. But they were soon awakened to the stern reality, and had to fight against overwhelming odds, not merely for victory, but for very life. The Battle of Inkerman has been described as the bloodiest struggle ever witnessed since war cursed the earth. It is said to have been a series of dreadful deeds of daring, of sanguinary hand-to-hand fights, of despairing rallies, of desperate assaults in glens and valleys, in brushwood glades and remote dells, hidden from all human eyes, and from which the conquerors, Russian or British, issued only to engage fresh foes, till our old supremacy, so rudely assailed, was triumphantly asserted, and the battalions of the Tsar gave way before our steady courage. Some of the most brilliant feats of arms were displayed at the Sandbag battery, which had been occupied by the Russians, and from which they sent a deadly fire on the British troops. Some of the Grenadier Guards were impatient to seize the battery, and one of them cried, "If an officer will lead us, we will charge." Captain Sir Charles Russell heard him, and, waving his revolver, shouted out, "Come on, my lads, who will follow me?" Several men at once sprang forward, and their brave example stimulated others to join in the charge. Russell rushed out and encountered a Russian, at whom he levelled his revolver, but it missed fire. He pulled again, and his opponent fell. Just then he felt a hand laid on his arm, and looking round he saw one of his men, who said, "You were near done for." Russell answered, "Oh no, he was some way from me." To this the Grenadier replied, "His bayonet was all but into you when I clouted him over the head." It seems that one of the Russians had managed to get behind the captain, and was in the very act of running him through when the soldier struck him down, and thereby saved his officer's life. Russell then asked the man what was his name, and on being told Anthony Palmer, he promised, "Well, if I live through this, you shall not be forgotten." In the desperate struggle which followed, the Russians surrounded the little band in almost overwhelming numbers, and Russell had more than one narrow escape. In a hand-to-hand struggle with one of the enemy, he, though by no means a powerful man, succeeded in tearing his rifle from him. This trophy of his prowess Sir Charles carried out of the action. Palmer also distinguished himself by the part he took in defending the colours from falling into the hands of the enemy. At length valour triumphed and the Russians were beaten. Sir Charles Russell and Palmer both received the Victoria Cross, and Palmer was publicly made a corporal on parade next morning. We have already seen how a soldier will risk his life in defence of his country's flag. Now we will give an example of the gallant manner in which he protects his guns from falling into the enemy's hands. During the Battle of Inkerman, 3 guns under Lieutenant Miller were put in position on some high ground overlooking the scene of conflict. Scarcely had they been loaded when a small body of British soldiers were pressed back on them by a large force of Russian infantry. As the guns could not be removed in time, Lieutenant Miller asked the officer in command of the soldiers to help him to defend them. He, however, thought that it would only be a useless waste of life to face the advancing host of Russians, and continued the retreat. Miller ordered his men to fire, but only 1 round could be discharged when the enemy were upon them. They came on, uttering strange, joyous cries. Left without any support, Miller, in despair, bade his gunners "draw swords and charge." He himself, under a shower of bullets, rode straight for the Russians. Evidently bewildered by this sudden and bold attack, they paused for a moment. Then there followed a short, sharp struggle. Miller and his handful of gunners laid about them furiously with swords and rammers, and it is said that one of the men, who was a mighty boxer, scorned to make use of any other weapons than those which nature had bestowed on him, and felled man after man with his fist. Such an unequal combat could not last, and in the end the enemy obtained possession of the guns, which, however, they did not hold for long. Lieutenant Miller came out of the encounter without a scratch, and received the Victoria Cross for his spirited conduct. Some time after this, a gun in charge of Sergeant Major Henry was suddenly surrounded by the enemy. He called upon his men to defend their gun, and he and another gunner named Taylor drew their swords and prepared to resist. The enemy attacked them, but Henry's courage never forsook him. He snatched a rifle out of the grasp of one of his antagonists, and defended himself with great skill against several others. Just then Taylor was slain, and many of the gunners fell. Surrounded on all sides, Henry received a bayonet wound in the chest, and was almost at the same time stabbed in the back. He sank to the ground apparently lifeless, but the Russians, as was their wont, still continued to strike at him. Before he was rescued he received 12 wounds, yet he lived to wear the reward of his valour. An exploit of wonderful daring and brilliancy secured for Lieutenant Clifford the honour of the Victoria Cross. Observing that the Russians had sent a strong force to take one of our regiments in the rear, he determined to avert the threatened disaster. Knowing that there was no time to spare, he took upon himself the responsibility of leading the attack. Calling out to those who could hear him, "Come and charge with me," he galloped off and dashed into the midst of the hostile ranks alone, for his men, not being mounted, were some distance behind. The Russians were, as usual, bewildered, evidently thinking that this single horseman was but the first of a troop of cavalry. When they saw that it was not so, they began to make a show of resistance, but it was of no use. Clifford and his men were invincible. With the strength of a young Hercules, he thrust and cut and parried, and in the midst of it all even found time to save the life of one of his men. At length the enemy lost heart altogether, laid down their arms, and gave themselves up as prisoners to a mere handful of men whom they could have with ease annihilated. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Stories of the Victoria Cross by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Noble 600. The most brilliant episode in the Crimean War was the famous Charge of the Light Brigade at Balaclava. The magnificence of the feat, the desperate gallantry, the hopeless miracle of devotion. All this is an heirloom which the British Army, and indeed every British citizen, must continue to rate high. Owing to a misunderstanding of the instructions which he had received, Lord Cardigan ordered the Light Brigade, numbering over 600 mounted men, to charge the Russian guns, posted at the end of a valley about a mile away, and supported by the whole army. To obey the order seemed to be certain death, as few of that gallant brigade could expect to return. Yet they advanced as calmly as if on parade. For a short distance they proceeded at a trot, and then the Russian batteries opened fire. The trot broke into a gallop, and as they neared the enemy, the fierce desire of the troopers could no longer be kept in check, and they charged at racing speed, stormed at by shot and shell, while horse and hero fell. A more fearful spectacle was never witnessed than that of these heroes rushing into the arms of death. The Russians fired with great rapidity and deadly accuracy, but the horsemen did not halt or even check their speed for an instant. They closed up the gaps in their ranks and pressed on. With a halo of flashing steel above their heads, and with a cheer which was many a noble fellow's death cry, they flew into the smoke of the batteries and went crashing through the enemy's lines. Then the voice of one of the officers was heard clearly above the din of battle, shouting, "Now, my brave lads, for Old England! Conquer or die!" Cossack and Russian reeled from the sabre stroke, shattered and sundered. Then they rode back, but not the 600. Just as our men were about to retire, an enormous mass of grey-coated lancers were hurled on their flank. The colonel of the 8th Hussars collected a few men, dashed into the midst of the Russians, and succeeded in cutting his way through with great loss. Others followed his example, and, with almost superhuman strength and courage, gradually forced their way through the dense throng which encircled them. Meanwhile, the Russian artillerymen returned to the guns which they had been forced to abandon, and, heedless of the fact that their own countrymen were mingled with our men, they fired into the struggling mass of humanity, thus destroying both friend and foe. Never before or since has such an atrocity been committed by any civilised nation. When the wreck of the gallant brigade mustered after the charge, Lord Cardigan said, "Men, it is a mad-brained trick, but it is no fault of mine." "Never mind, my lord," the men called out. "We are ready to go again." "No, no, men," he replied, "you have done enough." It is impossible to find a greater instance of discipline and devotion to duty, of more romantic courage, or desperate adventure. Though the charge was productive of no solid advantage, it showed that the British heart was as high in spirit, and the British arm as strong, as in the knightly days of old." Well might a French general who witnessed the charge exclaim, " C'est magnifique," or "It is magnificent." When can their glory fade? Oh, the wild charge they made! All the world wondered. Honour the charge they made! Honour the Light Brigade! Noble 600! One of the many who had their horses shot under them in that fierce ride was Troop Sergeant Major Berryman of the 17th Lancers. Getting hold of a riderless horse, he remounted, but almost immediately afterwards the animal dropped dead, having been previously wounded. Seeing that there was no chance of being able to rejoin his regiment, Berryman determined to return to the rear. On his way he saw that one of his officers named Captain Webb had halted. Fearing that something was wrong, he ran to him and asked what was the matter. The captain replied that he had been struck, and that his wound was so painful that he could not ride any further. Berryman called to a passing soldier to hold the horse's head while he lifted the captain down. This was done without further accident, and the gallant sergeant told the soldier to mount the horse and ride for a stretcher. He then sat down beside the wounded officer. Knowing well the barbarous nature of the enemy, and the extreme danger in which he was placed, Webb told Berryman that he had better consult his own safety and make for the rear. "Not at all," he replied. "I'll stay with you now." "Don't mind me, look to yourself," the officer again urged. "All right, sir, but we will go together, no matter what happens." Obtaining the assistance of another soldier, they made a chair by crossing their hands, and in this way carried the wounded man for some distance, till he again complained of the pain of his wound. Not to be beaten, Berryman enlisted the aid of a third man to support the captain's legs, until a better means of conveyance could be procured. At length a stretcher was obtained, and Webb was taken to the surgeons who dressed his wound, but unfortunately he was beyond all human aid, and died shortly afterwards. Sergeant Berryman, however, received the Victoria Cross for the assistance he had so bravely rendered. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Stories of the Victoria Cross by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Lady with the Lamp. The Victoria Cross has not yet been awarded to a woman, else Florence Nightingale would have received the coveted decoration. She, however, was one of the first to receive the Royal Red Cross. The story of self-sacrificing bravery displayed by this devoted woman will never be forgotten. Our wounded soldiers were huddled together, languishing on their rough beds, destitute of attention, comfort, and all necessary remedies. Everything was in disorder, and the appeal of the sufferers for help stirred the mighty heart of the English people. In response to that cry, Florence Nightingale, with a band of nurses, went out to the seat of war. Before many weeks had passed, she brought about an almost miraculous change in the hospitals, and where confusion and wretchedness had held sway, order and comfort reigned supreme. She was everywhere, at the bedside of the wounded soldier, staunching his wound and soothing his pain, in the laundry, in the kitchen, she was ever active, and but for her many a poor fellow must have died. Of her one writer said, "Wherever there is disease in its most dangerous form, and the hand of the spoiler distressingly nigh, there is that incomparable woman sure to be seen. Her benignant presence is an influence for good comfort even amid the struggles of expiring nature. She is a ministering angel without exaggeration in these hospitals, and as her slender form glides quietly along each corridor, every poor fellow's face softens with gratitude at the sight of her. When all the medical officers have retired for the night, and silence and darkness have settled down upon these miles of prostrate sick, she may be observed, lamp in hand, making her solitary rounds. As she moved gently about, seeing that no sufferer was in want of anything, she would speak to one and another," wrote a soldier, "and nod and smile to many more. But she could not do it all, you know. We lay there in hundreds, but we could kiss her shadow as it fell, and lay our heads on the pillow again, content." When the war was over, and the object of her mission had been accomplished, Florence Nightingale returned to England. Her fame had gone before her, and on her arrival she found herself the heroine of the hour. Her name was on every tongue, and her praises were on every lip. Many who had never seen her loved her for the care she had taken of those near and dear to them in the hour of their greatest need. Though she did not receive the Victoria Cross, other honours were in store. From the Queen she received an autograph letter of thanks and a St. George's Cross in red on a white ground. In the centre of the cross are the letters V.R., surmounted by a crown of diamonds, with the word Crimea in gold letters. Round the cross is a black band, on which are inscribed the words, "Blessed are the merciful." The nation raised a sum of £50,000 as a testimonial fund. It was devoted to the establishing and maintenance of the Nightingale Home for the training of nurses. Santa Filomena, or Saint Nightingale. A poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Whene'er a noble deed is wrought, whene'er is spoken a noble thought, our hearts in glad surprise to higher levels rise. The tidal wave of deeper souls into our inmost being rolls, and lifts us unawares out of all meaner cares. Honour to those whose words or deeds thus help us in our daily needs, and by their overflow raise us from what is low. Thus thought I, as by night I read of the great army of the dead, the trenches cold and damp, the starved and frozen camp, the wounded from the battle plain in dreary hospitals of pain, the cheerless corridors, the cold and stony floors. Lo, in that house of misery, a lady with a lamp I see pass through the glimmering gloom, and flit from room to room. And slow as in a dream of bliss, the speechless sufferer turns to kiss her shadow as it falls upon the darkening walls. As if a door in heaven should be opened and then closed suddenly, the vision came and went, the light shone and was spent. On England's annals, through the long hereafter of her speech and song, that light its rays shall cast from portals of the past. A lady with a lamp shall stand in the great history of the land, a noble type of good, heroic womanhood. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Stories of the Victoria Cross by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Gallant Nine. On the morning of the 11th of May, 1857, the day after the outbreak of the Indian Mutiny, the rebels swarmed into the imperial city of Delhi, where they were quickly joined by the native garrison. Inflamed with religious zeal, and with the blood they had already shed, the mutineers rode through the streets, carrying all before them, and spreading destruction on every side. Close to the palace stood the largest magazine of military stores in India. It contained many heavy cannon, an extensive supply of firearms and other weapons, and an enormous quantity of gunpowder. This magazine was in charge of Lieutenant Willoughby, and under him were Lieutenants Rayner and Forrest, Conductors Scully and Buckley, 4 other British soldiers, and a number of natives. While they were busy with their ordinary duties that morning, word came that the mutineers were close at hand, and as it was of the utmost importance that they should not gain possession of the stores, Willoughby at once prepared to defend the post. By the excited manner of the native soldiers who were with him, he at once concluded that they could not be trusted, but he consoled himself with the thought that, even without their aid, he and his companions might hold out until assistance came. It was indeed a desperate resolve, for what could 9 men do against thousands of infuriated sepoys? If they could not hold their own, they could at least die like heroes, and if help did not come in time, they could fire the magazine and bury themselves and their foes in its ruins. At least, such were the conclusions arrived at by the gallant officer. When Willoughby informed his companions of the course he intended to pursue, he received their instant and hearty approval. The gates were closed and barricaded, guns were put in position, and everything made ready for a determined resistance. When their arrangements for the defence of the magazine were complete, a train was laid ready to be fired at a given signal, when further resistance was impossible. Shortly afterwards, the rebels, in the name of the King of Delhi, demanded the surrender of the magazine. To this demand no reply was given, and other messages of the same kind were also treated with silent contempt. Thereupon, the King sent word that unless his demands were at once complied with, the magazine would be taken by force. Even this threat failed to extort a reply from the Gallant Nine. Determined to obtain possession of the military stores, the King ordered the walls to be scaled. When the rebels made the attack, the sepoys who were inside the magazine joined their countrymen and assisted in the assault. The little band of Britons received the enemy with a withering fire, and though round after round of grape shot was poured into their ranks, the deadly hail seemed to have little effect on the overwhelming numbers. The rebels on the walls kept up an incessant fire on the brave defenders, who, careless of the leaden shower, loaded and fired the guns as steadily as if shooting at a target. How many were slain at this time can never be known, for the rebels exposed themselves in the most reckless manner. Maddened by the resistance of a few Englishmen, they pressed on, confident in their strength, and determined to carry the position at all hazards. At length all the ammunition that had been brought out was exhausted, and as 2 of the gunners were wounded, no one could be spared to fetch more. The sepoys were entering the enclosure at various points, and shouts of triumph could be heard on all sides. It was no longer possible to prevent the stores of arms and ammunition from falling into the enemy's hands. Then Willoughby gave the signal to fire the train. This was done by Scully. In a few seconds there was a sullen roar, followed by a tremendous explosion. It seemed as if the very earth was splitting to its foundations. Over the palace and the city a shadow seemed to fall as the contents of the magazine ascended into the air. A cloud of white smoke streaked with dark objects, a shower of bodies, of stones, cannon, shot, shell and bullets, and the heroic deed was accomplished. Over 500 of the mutineers perished. Not one of the Gallant Nine ever expected to live to tell the tale. Scully and 4 of his companions were never seen again. The remaining 4, however, escaped from the scene of the explosion. Though terribly scorched and wounded, Forrest, Rayner and Buckley reached Meerut, 34 miles distant, in safety. Willoughby, however, was not so successful. While hiding in the jungle he was captured by the natives and put to death. Thus ended one of the most patriotic acts recorded in the annals of war. The effect of this heroic deed, which has given to those Gallant Nine a cherished place in history, can never be exactly computed. But the grandeur of its conception is not to be measured by its results. From the one end of India to the other it filled men's minds with enthusiastic admiration. When the news reached England that a young officer named Willoughby had blown up the Delhi magazine, there was a burst of applause that came from the deep heart of the nation. It was the first of many intrepid acts which have made us proud of our countrymen in India, but its brilliancy has never been eclipsed. Forrest, Rayner and Buckley received the Victoria Cross for their share in this splendid exploit, the first for which it was given in the Indian Mutiny. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Stories of the Victoria Cross by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 3-1. During the siege of Delhi, the English force in front of the city was startled by the appearance of a large body of Sawars, or native cavalry, making towards a piece of high ground to the rear of the camp, called the Mound. Here were posted 3 heavy guns, a picket of infantry, and 30 lancers under Lieutenant Martian. Some distance in front of the Mound there was a cavalry picket and 2 guns of the Horse Artillery in charge of Lieutenant Hill. As the Sawars still wore the British uniform, they were at first thought to be friends, but this mistake was soon discovered and caused a panic among the cavalry picket, who turned and fled. Thereupon the majority of the rebels dashed into the camp and attempted to seize the heavy guns. But they were met by a spirited resistance from Martin and his 30 lancers. The enemy came within 50 yards and circled round, but they were met by the lancers at every turn. Finding it impossible to capture the guns, they withdrew. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Hill, in charge of the 2 horse artillery guns, was faring badly. Like the other officers, Hill had at first supposed that the approaching horsemen were friends, and when he discovered that they were rebels, he at once exerted himself to bring his guns into position. It was, however, too late. The Sawars were upon him. Hill's next thought was how to prevent the guns falling into the hands of the rebels, and to achieve this he was ready to sacrifice himself. Driving his spurs into his horse, he charged the enemy with tremendous fury, hacking and hewing right and left. 2 Sawars charged him at the same moment, and so great was the shock of the collision that both horse and rider were hurled to the ground. Though stunned by the fall, the hardy lieutenant instantly sprang to his feet, seized his sword, and stood at bay. 3 of the rebels advanced to attack him, 2 mounted and 1 on foot. Though short of stature and breathless with his recent exertions, he quickly put the 2 mounted men out of the fighting list, severely wounding the one and killing the other. The Sawar on foot, however, fresh and active, was yet to be dealt with. The day had been wet, and Hill was encumbered by his heavy riding cloak. Twice he tried to discharge his revolver, but each time it missed fire. He also made a desperate thrust with his sword, but his arm caught in the cloak and the blow fell short. Then, with wonderful dexterity, the rebel seized the weapon and snatched it out of the grasp of his adversary. Though disarmed and spent with changing blows, the plucky lieutenant would not give in. Closing with the rebel, and thus preventing him from using his sword, Hill made a free use of his fists, and it seemed as if the tide of fortune was about to turn, when he slipped on the wet ground and fell. In another moment all would be over. The Sawar raised his arm to deal the fatal blow, when suddenly the report of a pistol rang out, the uplifted arm dropped powerless, and, as the rebel fell, a crimson streak on his white tunic told that a bullet had found its mark. Who had fired the shot? Major Toombs, the captain of the artillery troop, on ascending the mound, had his attention arrested by the sight of his junior officer lying on the ground, entangled in his cloak, while a rebel stood over him about to give him a final blow. 30 yards separated the major and the officer, and before he could cover the distance the rebel would have completed his work. He therefore decided to risk a shot. Resting his revolver on his left arm, he took a steady aim and fired, with the result already known. The moment Toombs saw that his shot had been successful, he hurried up and helped Hill to rise. As they stood talking, the lieutenant observed a Sawar making off with his revolver, which he had dropped in the conflict. Roused at the thought of losing his weapon, and forgetting the severe exertions and terrible danger through which he had just passed, the lieutenant dashed after the retreating rebel, determined to recover the revolver. Major Toombs followed. Finding that he was pursued, the Sawar turned and stood at bay. He aimed a blow at Hill, but he turned it aside, and Toombs did the same when the rebel made a desperate attempt to cleave his skull. The native rushed again upon Hill, and delivered a blow with such fury that his guard was broken down, and he received a deep wound on the head, and fell senseless to the ground. He next turned his attention to Toombs, who, parrying his cut, ran him through the body. Major Toombs and Lieutenant Hill both received the Victoria Cross. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Stories of the Victoria Cross by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Humane and Brave. One of the most thrilling incidents of the mutiny was the defence of Harari. 12 Europeans and a small force of Sikhs were shut up in a 2-storied dwelling house, and bravely withstood the repeated attacks of thousands of sepoys for about a week before help arrived. An attempt was made to relieve the little band sooner, but it ended in failure. A force of 400 men under Captain Dunbar embarked on the Ganges at Dinapur, 24 miles distant, to go to the help of the besieged. At 7 in the evening they landed and began their march. All went well till within 3 miles of their destination, when a murderous fire was opened on them from behind a thick grove of trees. The soldiers fell thick and fast, for they were on high ground, while the foe lurked unseen. Captain Dunbar was among the first to fall, and after that all was confusion and slaughter. After a time our men rallied and sought refuge in a hollow, but they were still exposed to the fire of the lurking foe. At daybreak the little band decided that their only hope of safety lay in retreat, so, exhausted, hungry and dispirited, they began to retrace their steps. From behind every tree, as it seemed, poured the leaden hail, but they kept steadily on towards the river. At length they were seized with panic, and the sole desire of each man was to save his own skin. But, disastrous as was the retreat, it was not all disgraceful. There will always be acts of individual heroism when Englishmen go out to battle. It may be a soldier, or it may be a civilian, in whom the irrepressible warrior instinct manifests itself in some act of conspicuous gallantry and devotion, but it is sure never to be wanting. Amongst those who accompanied the relief expedition were Ross Mangles and McDonnell, both members of the Civil Service. On the march they gave great assistance and acted as guides. When the firing began, Mangles was stunned by a musket ball, but he soon recovered, and busied himself in helping the surgeon to bind up his comrades' wounds, and in carrying water to ease the burning agony of their thirst. When the retreat began, he inspired those near him with hope and courage by his resolute bearing. He managed to keep near him a small knot of men, who supplied him with a succession of loaded muskets. As he was a dead shot, the sepoys thought proper to keep their distance. He seemed to bear a charmed life, for though men fell round him on all sides, he was untouched. About 6 miles from the river, a soldier of the 37th Regiment, who had been wounded and left helpless on the ground, begged Mangles not to leave him to be butchered by the sepoys. He did not ask in vain. Kneeling down amid the storm of musketry, Mangles bound up the man's wounds, lifted him upon his back, and marched on with his burden. Though he had not broken his fast for 24 hours, nor closed his eyes in sleep for 48, he afterwards declared that he had never felt so strong in his life." Over the rough and swampy ground he bore his helpless charge, though frequently obliged to lay down his burden and rest. Even then he stood over the wounded man and fired at the rebels whenever he had a chance. At last the weary 6 miles were covered and the river was reached. Then, swimming out and holding up the helpless man in the water, Mangles got him safely into one of the boats. He afterwards saw him into good hands at the hospital at Dinapur, with leisure to thank God and his preserver for his almost miraculous deliverance. The soldier's name was Richard Taylor, and several months passed before he was able to leave the hospital and to be sent back to England. Mangles was not rewarded for his gallantry at the time, but about 12 months later his deed was brought to light by the journal of a surgeon, in which was recorded the gratitude of the wounded soldier. Mangles afterwards received the Victoria Cross he had so richly deserved. The modesty which allowed the event to remain unknown to those in authority for so long a time is not the least remarkable feature in the story. Equally heroic was the exploit of McDonnell. Always in the front, and always in the thick of the fight, he greatly distinguished himself, and many a rebel fell beneath his unerring fire. Though wounded, he fought with the same dashing gallantry during the retreat. On reaching the river, he assisted those more severely wounded than himself to embark. Then, when all were on board, he entered the last boat. The breeze was blowing favourably for their escape, and deliverance seemed to be at hand. But the rebels had taken away the oars and tied the helm, so that the boat was carried back again towards the bank it had just left. A shower of the enemy's musket balls came thick and fast. Certain destruction stared the weary soldiers in the face. McDonnell, seeing the state of affairs, called upon the men to cut the ropes which prevented the rudder from being worked. Secure under the covered roof of the boat, the men would not stir. McDonnell then went out on to the roof, knife in hand, and cut the fastenings of the rudder amid a very storm of bullets from the bank, some of which passed through his helmet, but did no other damage. Then, seizing the tiller, he guided the boat to the opposite side of the stream in safety, thus saving the lives of 35 men. We may judge of the peril in which he was placed when we know that during the passage of the river 3 men were shot dead and 3 severely wounded. McDonnell afterwards received the crowning glory of the Victoria Cross. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Stories of the Victoria Cross by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A brave surgeon. When the relieving force under General Havelock entered the Residency of Lucknow, they were compelled to leave many of the wounded behind them in the streets of the city in the care of Surgeon Home. For fear that they might fall into the hands of the Sepoys, a number of soldiers were sent to guard them on their way to the Residency. A start was made, and for a short distance all went well. While crossing a stream, the rebels opened fire on the refugees, some of whom were shot while others were drowned. The greater number, however, managed to reach the other side, and were borne into what appeared to be a deserted street. But it was in reality lined with Sepoys. No sooner had they entered than a storm of musketry assailed them from the tops of the houses. The escort and the litter bearers, most of them natives, fell fast, and the remainder flung down their burdens and fled for their lives. In this emergency, Dr. Home tried to make use of those who were not quite disabled by their wounds, and of the remainder of the escort in carrying the wounded, but the enemy were mustering on all sides, and it was impossible to go farther. Dr. Home and 4 men rushed into a house close at hand, where they were afterwards joined by 2 wounded officers and a few men of the escort. The house in which they had taken refuge was a 1-storied building with a large number of windows. Here they were soon surrounded by nearly 1,000 Sepoys, who made several desperate attempts to reach them. They were, however, repulsed each time, chiefly by the heroic exertions of a private soldier named McManus. He took up a position outside, behind the shelter of a pillar, and kept up an incessant fire on the rebels until he was wounded. Meanwhile, Dr. Home and his few followers made a barricade of sandbags, by digging up the earthen floor of the house with their bayonets, and using the dead Sepoys' clothes to hold the soil. Unable to gain possession of the house, the natives turned on the wounded, who were lying helpless in the litters, and proceeded to massacre them. As was frequently the case during the Indian Mutiny, the blackness of disaster was lighted up by a display of genuine heroism. Roused to madness by the cries of the wounded, McManus, whom we have already mentioned, and Private Ryan, rushed out of the house to try and rescue some of their comrades. Heedless of the fire of the rebels, they went backward and forward several times, and succeeded in bringing in several of the wounded. It is a singular fact that neither of these gallant fellows were hurt while performing this humane act. They afterwards received the Victoria Cross. The duties which fell to the lot of Dr. Home at this time were neither few nor light. As the only unwounded officer, he had to command and encourage the men. As the surgeon, he had to attend to the wounded, and, as a man, he had to use his rifle with the rest, and right well did he discharge his responsibilities. Finding that they could not achieve their object by force, the Sepoys tried stratagem. Stealthily creeping up to the windows, they fired in, but without success, as our men threw themselves on the floor, and the shots passed harmlessly over them. The doctor then placed a man at each window, and 3 to guard the door. After a time, a Sepoy crept up very cautiously to the window at which Dr. Home was standing. Quite unconscious that his every movement was being watched, he raised his rifle to fire, when a shot from the doctor's revolver laid him on the ground, never to rise again. The rebels now drew off, and contented themselves with firing an occasional volley. This continued for about an hour, when a dull, rumbling noise was heard in the street. Thinking they were about to fire a cannon into the building, Home called out, "Now, men, now or never! Let us rush out and die in the open air, and not be killed like rats in a hole. They are bringing a gun on us." The soldiers prepared to obey his orders, when they saw that it was not a gun, but a screen on wheels with thick planks in front, through which no bullets could pass. The rebels brought the screen close up to the house, and in less than half an hour they succeeded in setting fire to the roof, hoping in this way to seal the fate of those within. They, however, escaped by breaking through into the second room, which led into a large square. Here they found a shed, into which they carried their wounded, and made preparations for further resistance. Unfortunately, the shed had been used as a cover for the rebels, from which they fired on the relieving force, and was loopholed everywhere, so that the position of Holmes' party was indeed perilous. A man was placed at every loophole, and even the wounded were put to watch. "This," says Dr. Home, "soon checked the bold, brave sepoys, for whom one British soldier is an object of terrible dread." Fresh trouble, however, was in store. The mutineers got on to the roof, bored holes in it, and fired into the sheds. Nothing more wonderful in the way of narrow escapes was ever seen. 2 shots were fired at the surgeon within 4 feet of his head, but he received no injury beyond a slight wound in the hand. About 50 yards from the shed was a mosque, which, if it could only be reached, would afford a more substantial shelter. Accordingly, a hole was broken through one of the sides of the shed, and under cover of darkness Dr. Home and one of the soldiers crept cautiously out to examine the building. By crawling on all fours, the surgeon succeeded in reaching the mosque, and found it empty. But before the wounded could be conveyed thither, their movements were discovered, and they had to remain where they were. Home, however, secured a supply of water, which was a priceless treasure. The wounded were dying with thirst, and those who had been fighting all day were almost as bad. Fortunately, the water was sufficient to give every man a good draught. The terrors of that awful night were almost maddening. Raging thirst, uncertainty as to where the sepoys would next make an attack, together with the exhaustion produced by want of food, heat, and anxiety. The welcome dawn at length chased away the night, but it brought no relief. Worn out with the strain of the past 24 hours, the men abandoned themselves to despair. All at once a sharp firing was heard outside, which sounded like the report of British rifles. Ryan, who was sentry, shouted out, "Oh boys, them's our chaps." No sooner had he spoken than a regular rattling volley rang out, such as no sepoys could give. The men, who a moment before were longing for the welcome release of death, sprang to their feet, all fire and animation. "Men, cheer together!" cried the gallant Home, and a joyous shout was raised. Those outside heard it, and replied with a ringing cheer that struck terror into the hearts of the rebels. 5 minutes later the work of rescue was completed, and all were saved. For this conspicuous devotion Home received the Victoria Cross, and surely it was never conferred on one more worthy of the honour. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Stories of the Victoria Cross by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Hero of Coelho. One evening in July 1857, several officers of the South Mahratta Horse, stationed at Satara, were discussing the mutiny and wondering if it would extend to that part of the country. All indulged in gloomy forebodings, except one young officer who took a more hopeful view of the situation. This was Lieutenant Kerr of the South Mahratta Horse, an officer who had already secured the confidence and respect of the wild troopers under his command. He expressed his conviction that, however treacherous the other troops might prove, he could always count upon the loyalty of the South Mahratta Horse, and if any emergency should occur, it would be seen that their courage was equal to their loyalty. He had scarcely finished speaking when a telegram was handed to the commanding officer. The door was carefully closed to prevent the servants from hearing, for at that trying period every native was suspected of being a rebel in disguise. It proved to be a message from Coelho, a town about 70 miles distant, saying that the native infantry had mutinied and murdered every officer on whom they could lay their hands. Some, however, had escaped and taken refuge in the Residency, where they were protected by a few faithful native troops. Food they had none, and unless help came speedily they would be compelled to surrender, and if they fell into the hands of the enemy, a lingering death by the most horrible tortures was certain to be their fate. The commanding officer hesitated for a moment, as he was doubtful whether he could trust his men if they were sent to Coelho. But Kerr assured him that they were perfectly trustworthy, and volunteered to lead a party of the South Mahratta Horse to the rescue. Half an hour later he left Satara at the head of 50 horsemen, all that could be spared. Though his force was so small, the gallant lieutenant never for a moment doubted the success of his enterprise. It was in the middle of the wet season. Rain descended in torrents, the district was flooded, and the small streams had become rivers. The road between the two stations was not a road as we understand the term, and the horses often sank up to their knees in mud. But the dauntless Kerr and his little band pushed on. They were obliged to swim across 5 rivers and 7 ravines filled with water, but at length all obstacles were overcome, and in 26 hours they reached Coelho. Scorning the handful of men that had come against them, and half mad with murder and plunder, the mutineers looked upon victory as certain. They took up a position in a strong square fort with a massive gate at the entrance. Kerr was now in a very critical position. He had no guns except a couple which he had borrowed from a neighbouring Rajah, and these were useless. Night and darkness were at hand. His troopers were now ready and eager for the fray, but if he put off the attack till morning, there was a danger that they might then be afraid to follow him. Dismounting his men, he selected 17, of whose bravery and faithfulness he was well assured, and led them to the attack. Then the lieutenant and his right-hand man, who bore the singular name of Gumpunt Rao Deo Kerr, armed themselves with crowbars, and, heedless of the bullets which whistled around them, soon made an opening in the first door large enough for one man to crawl through on his hands and knees. Kerr and his men at once crept through, and their appearance was the signal for a tremendous volley from the sepoys, but it passed harmlessly over their heads. Without giving the rebels time to reload, Kerr rushed on them, followed by his men. A fierce hand-to-hand fight followed, but in the end the rebels, with great loss, were driven into a house which covered the second entrance. As this building was loopholed, a brisk fire was kept up on the little band, which rendered the storming of the fort more difficult. Finding one side on which there were no loopholes, Kerr got close to the building and succeeded in setting it on fire. Several of the enemy perished in the flames, and the remainder retreated into the inner part of the fort, where they were joined by the whole garrison. Kerr and his men followed, and found that another door had to be battered in before they could effect an entrance. Again the crowbar was brought into use, and, as before, an opening was made. In rushed the gallant lieutenant, closely followed by the faithful Gumpant Rao. They were greeted by another volley, but both escaped unhurt. In another moment Kerr and his Marathas were among the rebels who, knowing well the death that awaited them if conquered, fought with the energy of despair. One of their bullets cut the chain of Kerr's helmet, another struck his sword, and for a moment he was almost blinded by a musket discharged close to his face. Yet he ran his sword through the body of the man who fired it. So vigorous had been the thrust that Kerr could not at once withdraw his weapon, and while in this helpless condition he was struck on the head with the butt end of a musket. He reeled, and would have been stabbed by one of the rebels had not his Indian namesake rushed forward and laid the sepoy low. As the man fell, Kerr recovered and went dashing forward. The mutineers, driven to the last extremity, now took refuge in a building which had formerly been used as a temple. Having barricaded the door, they again opened fire on their assailants, whose numbers were now reduced to 7, the remaining 10 having been either killed or wounded. With this slender force, Kerr advanced to the door, crowbar in hand. This time, however, he failed to make an opening by its help, but seeing some hay laying near, he piled it against the door and set it on fire. In a few moments the flames had done their work. The door fell in, and through flame and smoke Kerr and his men dashed in upon the mutineers. Then followed a brief and terrible struggle, mingled with the clang and clash of weapons, the shouts of deadly hatred, and the groans of the wounded. Not a single sepoy escaped. All were either killed or taken prisoners. The consequences of this victory cannot be estimated. The officers at Coelho were saved. The rising spirit of mutiny in the Bombay Presidency received a final check, and it revived the confidence of both officers and men in each other. Of the gallant band that had accomplished so much, 8 were killed, 4 afterwards died of their wounds, and not one of them escaped unhurt. Great was the praise bestowed on Lieutenant Kerr for his dashing and devoted bravery, and well did he merit the Victoria Cross, which he received. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Stories of the Victoria Cross by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Lucknow Kavanagh. Among those shut up in the Residency at Lucknow was a civilian named Kavanagh. He had passed his whole life in India, and was perfectly acquainted with the language and customs of the Hindus. During the siege he had taken an active part in several sorties, and had on every occasion greatly distinguished himself. If danger in any form had to be encountered, Kavanagh was sure to offer his services. When Sir Colin Campbell was advancing to the relief of Lucknow, it was of the first importance that information should be conveyed to him concerning localities and other matters, so that the force within and the army without might be able to act together. Sir James Outram and General Havelock were quite at a loss in the matter, for they knew no native who could be trusted with so important a mission. For anyone but a native to try to pass through the rebel forces and the hostile population meant detection and certain death. Kavanagh heard of the difficulty in which his chiefs were placed, and at once volunteered. Sir James Outram at first refused to accept his offer, saying that he thought the attempt so dangerous that he would not have asked any officer to go. But there was no time to waste, so at length Sir James gave his consent, thinking, no doubt, that if anyone could succeed it was the gallant civilian. Accordingly, at 7:30 that night, Kavanagh appeared before his commander disguised as an irregular soldier of the city, with a sword and shield. His face down to the shoulders and his hands up to the wrists were coloured with lamp black. His dress consisted of a yellow silk courtar over a tight-fitting white muslin shirt, a yellow-coloured chintz sheet thrown round his shoulders, a cream-coloured turban, native-made shoes, and a white waistband. So complete was his disguise that his friends failed at first to recognise him. Having received his instructions, he set out on his perilous mission, accompanied by a native guide, and proceeded to the right bank of the River Gumtee. Here, he says, we undressed and quietly forded the river, which was only about 4 feet and a half deep, and about 100 yards wide at this point. My courage failed me while in the water, and if my guide had been within reach, I should perhaps have pulled him back and abandoned the enterprise. But he waded quickly through the stream, and, reaching the opposite bank, went crouching up a ditch for 300 yards to a grove of low trees on the edge of a pond, where we stopped to dress. My confidence now returned to me, and with my tulwar resting on my shoulder, we advanced into the huts in front, where I accosted a matchlockman, who answered to my remark that the night was cold. It is very cold. In fact, it is a cold night. I passed him, adding that it would be colder by and by. After going 600 or 700 yards farther, we reached the iron bridge over the Gumtee, where we were stopped and called over by a native officer. My guide advanced to the light, and I stayed a little back in the shade. After being told that we had come from Mundell, our old cantonment, and then in the possession of the enemy, and that we were going into the city to our homes, he let us proceed. Recrossing the Gumtee by the stone bridge, we went by a sentry unobserved, who was closely questioning a dirtily dressed native, and into the principal street of the city of Lucknow, which was not illuminated as much as it used to be previous to the siege, nor was it so crowded. I jostled against several armed men in the street without being spoken to. When issuing from the city into the country, we were challenged by a watchman, who, without stopping us, merely asked us who we were. I was in great spirits when we reached the green fields into which I had not been for 5 months. Everything around us smelt sweet, and a carrot I took from the roadside was the most delicious I had ever tasted. A farther walk of a few miles was accomplished in high spirits. But there was trouble before us. We had taken the wrong road, and were now quite out of our way, in a park which was occupied by the enemy. I went within 20 yards of 2 guns to see what strength they were, and returned to the guide, who was in great alarm, and begged that I would not distrust him because of the mistake, as it was caused by his anxiety to take me away from the pickets of the enemy. I bade him not to be frightened of me, as I was not annoyed, as such accidents were not infrequent, even when there was no danger to be avoided. It was now about midnight. We endeavoured to persuade a cultivator who was watching his crop to show us the way for a short distance, but he urged old age and lameness. Another whom I commanded to come with us ran off screaming and alarmed the whole village. We next walked quickly away into the canal, in which I fell several times, owing to my shoes being wet and slippery and my feet sore. The shoes were hard and tight, and had rubbed the skin off my toes and cut into the flesh above the heels. In 2 hours more we were again on the right road, 2 women in a village we passed having kindly helped us to find it. About 2 o'clock we reached an advanced picket of sepoys, who told us the way after asking us where we had come from and whither we were going. I thought it safer to go up to the picket than to try and pass them unobserved. The moon had risen by this time, and we could see well ahead. By 3 o'clock we arrived at a grove of mango trees, in which a man was singing at the top of his voice. I thought he was a villager, but he got alarmed on seeing us approach, and astonished us too by calling out a guard of 25 sepoys, all of whom asked questions. Here the guide lost heart for the first time, and threw away the letter entrusted to him for Sir Colin Campbell. I kept mine safe in my turban. The guard seemed greatly relieved on finding it was not their terrible foe, who was only a few miles in advance of them. After walking for half an hour, we got into a swamp. We had to wade through it for 2 hours up to our waists in water, and through weeds, but before we found out that we were in a swamp, we had gone too far to recede. I was nearly exhausted on getting out of the water, having made great exertions to force our way through the weeds, and prevent the colour being washed off my face. It was nearly gone from my hands. I now rested 15 minutes, in spite of the remonstrances of the guide, and then went forward, passing between 2 pickets of the enemy who had no sentries thrown out. It was near 4 o'clock in the morning when I stopped at the corner of a grove of trees to sleep for an hour, which the guide entreated I would not do. But I thought he overrated the danger, and, lying down, I told him to see if there was anyone in the grove who would tell him where we then were. We had not gone far when I heard the English challenge, "Who comes there?" with a native accent. We had reached a British cavalry outpost. My eyes filled with joyful tears, and I shook the Sikh officer in charge of the picket heartily by the hand. The old soldier was as pleased as myself when he heard from whence I had come, and he was good enough to send 2 of his men to conduct me to the camp of the advance guard. One of the British officers met me on the way and took me into his tent, where I got dry stockings and trousers. I thanked God for having conducted me through this dangerous enterprise, and the guide for the courage and intelligence with which he had conducted himself during this trying night. When we were questioned, he let me speak as little as possible. He always had a ready answer, and I feel that I am indebted to him in a great measure more than to myself for my escape. Kavanagh delivered his letter to Sir Colin Campbell, who considered his act one of the most daring feats ever attempted. When the relieving army advanced against Lucknow, Kavanagh was beside the commander all the time, and his intimate knowledge of the country was of the greatest benefit. When he once more returned to his friends, he was warmly praised for his devotion and welcomed as a hero. In undertaking this enterprise, Kavanagh was prompted by a high sense of duty, believing that he could be of use to the Commander in Chief, and he was also anxious to perform some service which would give him the honour of wearing the glorious Victoria Cross. His ambition was gratified. He received the coveted honour, and was, as a further reward, appointed Assistant Commissioner in Oude. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Stories of the Victoria Cross by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Breaking the Square. In the early days of January 1857, an expedition consisting of 2 British and 3 native regiments, under the command of Sir James Outram, left India for the Persian Gulf. Their object was to punish the Persians for ill-treating British residents at the capital, and for the repeated insults they had offered to the British flag. About the end of the month the troops landed at the town of Bushehr, which they took almost without opposition. After resting for a few days, they started to march into the interior. On the first 2 days the men suffered greatly from tempests of wind, accompanied by clouds of fine dry dust which penetrated the ears, eyes, nostrils and mouths of the soldiers, and seemed to force its way into the very pores of their skin. These were followed by dreadful thunderstorms, and rain fell in torrents. As the troops were without shelter of any kind, both officers and men were soon drenched to the skin. These uncomfortable surroundings, however, could not daunt the ardour of a body of men under the command of such a leader as Sir James Outram. On the 5th of February the Persian army was seen occupying a strong position, and the British troops were at once drawn up in line and ordered to advance upon them. The Persians, however, did not wait for their opponents, but speedily turned and fled, leaving their camp and all their military stores in the hands of the invaders. For 2 days the British were engaged in destroying the Persian camp, and in searching for buried treasure. While so engaged, the soldiers were constantly harassed by night alarms, none of which, however, were caused by the enemy. An amusing story is told of one of these night alarms. It happened that a soldier in his shirt and trousers had wandered some distance from our camp during the night, when an alarm rose that the enemy were upon us. Men, scarcely awake, rose to their feet, rifle in hand, and, seeing a white object in the distance rushing towards them, opened fire on it. The more the unfortunate man shouted, for he was within the white object, which was his shirt, the more rapid was the firing at him, until he came sufficiently near to be recognised. Fortunately, the darkness of the night and the hurried way in which the men fired saved him from being hit. On the evening of the 7th of February the troops set out to return to Bushehr. All went well until midnight, when the Persians attacked them in the rear. Though taken by surprise, the soldiers behaved with perfect steadiness. They received the charges of the enemy's horsemen with volley after volley. Then the Persians retired, and contented themselves with an occasional shot during the night. When the day broke, both armies prepared for battle. The Persians, about 8,000 strong, were drawn up near the village of Kushab. The British advanced to the attack under a heavy fire, and soon silenced the hostile guns. Then our cavalry swept down upon the Persian horsemen, and by a brilliant charge scattered them like smoke in all directions. They then made for the infantry, but these warriors had witnessed the dispersion of their comrades, and many of them did not wait to receive the charge. With the exception of 2 battalions, they turned and fled. One of these battalions at once made ready for the approaching onset. They formed square and prepared to receive cavalry. Those in the front rank knelt down on one knee and waited the charge with upraised bayonets. Those behind fired volley after volley with lightning rapidity. There was no sign of fear on the faces of these men. If they could not conquer, they were prepared to die. There are few instances in history of a square being broken by the heroic dash of one man. Perhaps you have read how, on one occasion, when the Swiss were fighting for their liberty against the Austrians, Arnold Winkelried rushed upon the pikes of the enemy, and with outstretched arms grasped 10 of them together. "Make way for liberty!" he cried. Made way for liberty, and died. His countrymen were not slow to take advantage of the gap thus made in the Austrian ranks, and in the end they won the victory. We shall now see how Lieutenant Moore performed this rare feat at the Battle of Kushab. Mounted on a superb charger, this gallant young officer rode furiously forward against the Persian square, leaving his comrades some distance behind. When within a few yards of the front rank, he put spurs to his horse and made it leap right on to the upraised bayonets of the enemy. The gallant steed fell dead within the square, but its work was successfully accomplished. The formation was broken, and the troopers rushed in through the gap. For some minutes nothing was heard but the clang and clash of arms, and the hoarse shouts of men engaged in deadly conflict. Then there arose the shrieks of the wounded and cries for mercy. All was soon over. A remnant of the battalion was flying wildly across the plains, with the horsemen in close pursuit. Where was Moore all this time? When the horse fell dead within the square, he was crushed beneath it, and his sword was broken. After getting clear of the dead animal, the lieutenant attempted to carve his way through the mass of the enemy with the stump of the sword that remained. The sight of the man who had been the means of bringing about their defeat roused the Persians, and they rapidly closed round him. Escape was impossible, and no man could hope for his life against such fearful odds. Just then Lieutenant Malcolmson saw the perilous position of his comrade. Setting spurs to his horse, he cleaved his way to Moore's side. Calling to him to seize hold of his stirrup, Malcolmson bravely dashed out of the crowd, bringing his companion with him in safety. Neither of these two heroes were wounded. Moore received the Victoria Cross for his conspicuous gallantry in breaking the square. The thoughtfulness for others, cool determination, devoted courage, and ready activity shown by Lieutenant Malcolmson gained for him also the coveted decoration. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Stories of the Victoria Cross by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Storming the Taku Forts. In 1858, a treaty was made between Great Britain and France on the one side, and China on the other, in which it was agreed that Great Britain should send a minister to reside in Pekin, and that British subjects should be allowed to travel in China. One of the conditions of this agreement was that it should be ratified at Pekin within a year. The Chinese strongly objected to the presence of foreigners in their sacred capital. Accordingly, when the ambassadors arrived at the mouth of the River Peiho, they found their farther progress barred, and on attempting to force a passage, they were repulsed, with a loss of many of their escort. This brought about a war with China, a land most remarkable for its quaint details, its remoteness from all European sympathies, so strangely exclusive, and known to us only and vaguely as the Celestial Empire, with the wonderful wall that girds it, as the land of tea and opium, of Aladdin and the wonderful lamp. In 1860 a British expedition was dispatched to China under the command of Sir James Hope Grant. There our force was joined by the French troops, and together the Allies advanced to storm the Taku forts. The country over which the troops had to pass was in appearance anything but cheerful. Black mud and pools of brackish water everywhere met the eye. The water in these pools was quite undrinkable. Not a well was to be found, and the district was dotted by sandhills, only useful for skirmishing riflemen. In the marshy ground the men often sank up to their waists, and could only extricate themselves after most exhausting efforts. To help the soldiers in their advance against the forts, it was resolved to make roads, and the engineers at once set to work. In spite of the almost incessant fire from the forts, the roads were speedily completed, and on the 20th of August the soldiers heard with joy that the attack would be made on the following morning. Before dawn on the 21st the troops advanced. When day broke, the Chinese opened fire from all the forts. Our guns replied, and soon the storm of war raged in all its fury. A well-directed shot entered the enemy's magazine, which exploded with terrific violence, shaking the country round about for miles, as if by an earthquake shock. The guns in the fort were silenced shortly afterwards. A storming party now advanced, accompanied by a detachment of marines carrying a pontoon bridge for the passage of the wet ditches in front of the fort. Then the enemy opened a heavy fire from their rifles, and the advance was continued under a shower of bullets. The efforts of the marines to lay down the pontoon bridge were unsuccessful, and after 16 men had been wounded, the attempt had to be abandoned. The French storming party were more successful in crossing the ditches. They employed a number of Chinese coolies to carry scaling ladders, and when these were found to be too short for their purpose, the coolies gallantly jumped into the water and held the ladders on their shoulders till the French got across. Several of our soldiers took advantage of this human bridge, but the greater number swam or waded to the other side. On reaching the fort, the French attempted to climb the walls, but they encountered a most vigorous resistance, and as fast as they reached the top, they were slain or hurled back by the defenders. The British, however, succeeded in effecting a breach large enough to admit one man at a time, and through this small opening the soldiers rushed to the final capture. Meanwhile, the British and French troops were eagerly striving for the honour of first planting a flag on the fort. Ensign Chaplin, who carried the colours of the 67th Regiment, was foremost in this friendly rivalry. After the explosion of the Chinese magazine, when the order to advance was given, he rushed forward at the head of the regiment, holding the standard proudly aloft. Before he had gone many yards, he received a bullet in the arm. Down dropped the flag, but only for a moment, while Chaplin hastily bound his handkerchief round the wound. Then he went after the regiment and once more took his place in the front. Though repeatedly urged by his comrades to go to the rear, he refused, and stuck to the colours, determined that nothing but death should hinder him from planting the English flag first on the highest part of the fort. In crossing the ditch, Chaplin met the French colour bearer, and playfully challenged that officer to enter the fort before him. A terrible scene of confusion followed the repulse of the French storming party, but throughout all the gallant ensign was eagerly on the watch for a chance to enter. When at length the breach was made, Chaplin rushed in and, clearing a path for himself, hurried towards the goal of his ambition. He allowed no one to impede his progress. Friends were pushed on one side, and foes were stretched upon the ground. A second wound, more serious than the first, caused him to stagger, and one of the soldiers rushed forward to seize the colours. Chaplin only tightened his grasp on the flagstaff, and, turning a deaf ear to all warnings, hurried on. It was not likely that he who had dared so much was going to give in now that success was about to crown his efforts. No, indeed. True, the French were behind him, but if he paused, the chances were that their standard bearer would rush in and win the race for glory. So he struggled up to the highest point of the fort, where he planted the English standard in triumph, being the first to mount to the position. Chaplin had just succeeded in his self-imposed task when a shot from a Chinese rifle struck him in the leg, and he fell severely wounded. Though weak from loss of blood, he held his ground till the regiment came up and saved him from falling into the hands of the enemy. Then the Chinese garrison, who had fought throughout with the most determined gallantry, fled, and the victory was won. For his bravery on this occasion Chaplin received the Victoria Cross. CHAPTER XIV.